So OPEC Plus has just done the unthinkable and the global economy is screwed. Demand across the world is already contracting. Exports from China and Japan are dropping. US imports are also heading down. Now what OPEC just did is going to destroy global demand even further. So if you're hoping for a soft landing, it might be time to shelve that idea. Saudi Arabia and Russia, they have twisted the knife deeper and reignited the inflation pain, especially in the West. In our lead story today, OPEC Plus agrees on deeper output cuts to avoid renewed surplus. We have to hang tight because an extra 1 million barrels per day is about to be taken away from the markets. Saudi Arabia, they have managed to convince the rest of OPEC to join in on the cuts. To seal the deal, the kingdom agreed to slash their own production again. OPEC Plus agrees to make 1 million barrels a day of additional oil supply cuts. This is alongside Saudi Arabia's extension of their voluntary reduction of 1 million barrels. Things will go into a vote and that will likely pass. And according to reports, Russia will also be slashing 500,000 barrels a day to squeeze production even further. The additional cuts plus the rollovers will exceed 2 million barrels, making the grand total well over 5 million. This is a clear signal that OPEC is moving to defend their turf. The economy is already on the verge of a collapse, but they don't care. It's all about driving revenue for them. And as a group, OPEC Plus produces over 45 million barrels of oil a day. That's equivalent to nearly 60% of global production in 2022. So they do have enormous bargaining power and the ability to swing the global markets. And the big boys are none other than Russia and Saudi Arabia. Both of them benefit from a spike in oil prices. Saudi Arabia has a big deficit hole they need to fill. They have fallen into Q3 deficit of $9.5 billion. And this is a big concern because 40% of their GDP comes from oil revenues. And if this continues, the kingdom will fall into a recession this year with GDP contracting by 0.3%, not something that MBS would want. For Russia, it's more obvious what Putin needs. He needs the price of oil to stay as high as possible to ramp up revenue. They need to ramp up the war spending. It's a battle of financial attrition, and if oil prices collapse, it won't be good for Moscow. Russia is going to increase defense spending by almost 70% in 2024 next year. Their overall budget is also going to jump by 22% as well. This can only happen if the price of oil stays high enough. So it wasn't hard to forecast a production cut by Saudi Arabia and Russia. The incentives are perfectly aligned. But let's talk about the timing and the strategy. OPEC isn't stupid. They know that the global economy is on the edge of a cliff. It's about to collapse. When you see global imports from the biggest economies stagnating or collapsing, there's a big problem with consumption. Countries are just too broke to import stuff, and this is going to hit exporters as well. And let's use Japan as an example. Their imports have been crashing with each passing month. It has gone from positive 17% in January, crashing all the way down to negative territory and staying there. Demand from the third biggest economy has collapsed. If we look at their exports, it's also a disaster. Since the start of 2023, export growth has dropped to near zero. This is happening when the Japanese yen is down almost 24%. A cheaper currency normally translates to cheaper exports, but it's not happening. It's very obvious that global demand is starting to shrink. People are either cutting consumption completely, or in China's and America's case, they are going local. And that's why on the surface, it seems like OPEC Plus, they have lost their minds, right? If you cut production now when the economy is wobbly, you'll only cripple it even further. It's not rocket science. But if you look at the big chess moves, especially from the United States, it makes total sense why OPEC Plus is cutting production now. OPEC is afraid of additional supply hitting the market next year, which will depress oil prices. The US is making big moves to counter OPEC, and the first is ramping up their own production of crude oil. US crude output rose by 1.7% in September, the largest increase since March. Since the start of 2020, America has been ramping up crude oil production from under 10 million barrels a day to 13.2 million barrels. An additional 3.2 million barrels a day of crude has entered the market. That's a 30% increase within 2 years, which is flooding the market with supply. That is helping to put a lid on prices. It's counteracting OPEC's production cuts. However, that is just the domestic production. The United States has also made big moves in South America to secure additional production. Just a month ago, Biden lifted sanctions on Venezuelan oil, Maduro can now start pumping more crude out of the ground without fear. And no, it wasn't just about free elections, right? It is to increase global supply to compete with OPEC. From Bloomberg, oil executives flocked to Venezuela, braving risks of US snapback sanctions. Not only are US companies heading there, we have Shell and Repsol scrambling there as well. Those are British and Spanish producers. They want a bite of the pie, and it's a very big pie. Venezuela currently produces around 800,000 barrels of oil a day, with 300 billion barrels of reserves under the ground. That's more than even Saudi Arabia. This makes Venezuela a huge risk to oil prices. And this is what OPEC fears, that global oil producers will jam into the country and explode oil production. As it stands, Venezuela is one of the few OPEC members exempt from making supply cuts because their economy is in the pits. While the rest of OPEC cuts production, Maduro can continue pumping more oil out of the ground. And that's why OPEC has to cut production now to increase oil prices while there's still time. Because oil demand is inelastic, when you cut production, the level of demand stays relatively the same, at least in the short term. You still need to put gas in the tank, fuel to run the ships, and diesel to generate power. And in many places in the world, they also use oil to produce electricity as well. If we look at Venezuela's production history, we can see the potential of supply that can flood the world. Their production hit a peak of 3.2 million barrels 12 years back. Now it's well below a million. With all the oil producers rushing to the country, this supply gap will be filled sooner or later. It might take 1, 2, 3, or even 5 years, but there's potentially at least 2 million barrels more that could be added to global supply. And this isn't good news for OPEC. Remember the agenda for Russia and Saudi Arabia. They both want higher oil prices, they need higher revenue. An oil cut is usually more severe than increasing supply because demand stays relatively constant, right? But if you flood the world with enough oil, you can crash prices. But now there's a demand problem as well. According to the IEA, global demand for crude will collapse in 2024 and stay low before rebounding back in Q4. Demand will crater from over 29 million barrels a day to under 28, which is a big drop. However, OPEC is forecasting sunshine and rainbows with oil demand staying high throughout next year. Now, if the IEA is right and demand collapses due to a recession, then OPEC revenues are doomed. If you cut production during a recession, you threaten to smash the world into a deeper slowdown, into a depression. And this is why OPEC is cutting production now while the going's still good, while the economy still looks robust, right? And deep down, I'm sure they know that the economy isn't strong, that it isn't resilient. But because the United States keeps borrowing endless amounts of money to spend, they can keep up this illusion for longer. With additional production coming from the Americas, there's bigger pressure for OPEC to act now. Saudi's forecast to cut oil price to Asia as competition heats up. Just before the cuts happened, there were already rumors of Aramco cutting their prices to Asia, their biggest customer. Traders are predicting the Arab Light crude to drop by over $1 for January delivery. China's oil demand isn't increasing because exports are dropping. Then you throw in the additional supply coming in 2024, and that's forcing Saudi Arabia to give discounts to compete. Basic demand and supply. But this isn't good for the global economy. By cutting supply, OPEC has just unleashed another gate of hell. They have let loose the chains of Cerberus, which is going to bite us with continued inflation. Consumers are going to get squeezed further and interest rates will stay higher for longer. The Federal Reserve won't be slashing rates like a Black Friday sale because in the short term, OPEC is still in control. Now let's talk about the biggest casualty of this production cut. It's not going to be the United States because they are more or less energy secure. Domestic production is high enough. And no, China isn't going to collapse either. They have access to cheap Russian oil, so they will be fine. The biggest casualty will be once again the Eurozone. While inflation has dropped down to 2.4% in the EU, the economy is already collapsing. The manufacturing and service side PMIs have been dropping for months. They have been staying under the 50 level for an extended period of time. That is the zone of contraction. PMI is a leading indicator. It is forecasting doom and gloom for Europe's economy. And the longer it stays below the 50 zone, the higher the odds of a Q4 GDP staying negative as well, aka a recession. Because of the OPEC cut, oil prices will stay elevated for quite some time. It might not spike to the moon, but it won't help the energy situation in the Eurozone either. Europe will still be sourcing energy at elevated prices, and winter is coming. It's December and the White Walkers are coming back. Last year, the EU managed to escape a collapse because winter was mild. Global warming, climate change actually helped them out. But will there be another Christmas miracle? We don't know because if winter is cold, the industrial collapse won't be over. Here's a very interesting chart of how Europe managed to survive the winter energy crisis in 2022. To stay afloat, the EU made brutal cutbacks to their gas usage last year. Good weather in pink accounted for the bulk of buildings and residential demand savings. In other words, they got lucky. Now look at the industrial use more carefully. They cut over 13 billion cubic meters of gas usage in production curtailments. They essentially reduced industrial production to save on gas consumption. In other words, their industry took a brutal hit because energy costs were just too high. So the OPEC Plus cuts is yet another straw on the camel's back. It slows down the fall of energy prices. But remember that it's all a relative game. Even if global prices comes down, the US and China still have a lower cost of production because they are located directly next to energy sources. America has their domestic production and oil from Canada up north. China has contracts locked in with Russia and the Middle East, and that leaves Europe out in the cold. Germany, for example, has a budget issue. Because of a court ruling, Olaf Scholz has a budget shortfall of 30 billion euros in 2024 and a total of 175 billion euros through 2027. And we know where the money is going to come from, right? It'll come from debt. Germany will borrow the money to existence at high interest rates. The OPEC decision is just going to complicate this issue. How much more money will be allocated for energy subsidies? Will this take money away from modernizing the German economy? And that's why the biggest loser of any energy crisis, like a production cut, will be Europe. So let's summarize this mess, right? OPEC's move tells us that everyone is in trouble. By cutting production, OPEC admits that they are losing some control, some ground of oil markets thanks to America's increasing production. Global demand is also in trouble as well because inflation will continue to stay sticky, which in turn affects interest rates. In the short term, OPEC Plus has issues they also need to work out because they can't keep cutting production forever. OPEC production cuts fails to convince oil traders. Producers like Angola reject their diminished quota and will continue to pump more oil. The group wanted Angola to reduce their quota by 200,000 barrels per day, but they refused. Angola shot back saying, "We will produce above the quota determined by OPEC." And here's why they decided to oppose the decision. While production cuts do firm up the oil price, it comes at your expense. That means producers like the United States can sell more volume at higher prices, which is a double win for them. So there is a tipping point where OPEC can't cut production anymore. And have we reached that point yet? I don't know. But in the short term, if the global economy continues to stay strong from all that endless borrowing, they might do the unthinkable again. So don't be surprised if OPEC does yet another cut in 2024, and that might be enough to push us towards a global recession. But let me know what you think in the comments below. Will OPEC cut again in 2024? And how bad is this for global demand? Let me know in the comments below. Stay safe, be sure to smash the like button and subscribe as we navigate through these crazy times.